It is an honor to introduce Dr. Selfa Chu today. The multi-talented and highly productive Dr. Chu received an MFA in creative writing as well as a PhD in Borderlands history at the University of Texas at El Paso. A playwright as well as a historian. Her play, Night Stalker, Mi Hermano Siames, was included in the 2013 National Theatrical Exhibit in Mexico. In 2015, her book, Cinco Obras de Teatro, garnered the Voces al Sol Publication Prize from the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez. She is presently a visiting assistant professor in the Department of History and the African American Studies program at the University of Texas at El Paso. Dr. Chu's powerful, meticulously researched book, Uprooting Community, Japanese Mexicans, World War II, and U.S. Mexico Borderlands, was the second place winner in the history category at the International Latino Book Awards just last month. This study confronts historical silence and erasure, excavating and bringing to light a long buried past. When I reached page 67, I suddenly realized that this erasure had affected my own perceptions. When I was a child, my family moved from Southern California to Arizona. We lived in a small town called Nogales on the U.S Mexico border. It is sometimes called Ambos Nogales because there are two towns, one on each side of the border, sharing the same name. There was at least one Chinese Mexican family in Nogales. It never occurred to me to wonder why there were no Japanese Mexicans. Now, thanks to Dr. Chu, I know why. In chapter 4, I learned that before World War II, two Mexican citizens of Japanese descent, Ignacio Koba and Luis Tanamachi, had owned and run a small barber shop in Nogales, Sonora. They and Tanamachi's wife were among the thousands of Japanese Mexicans forcibly uprooted from borderland communities and sent at their own expense to the interior. I have learned so much from Dr. Chu's research, which contributes important dimension to Asian American studies and Japanese American history. She has painstakingly combed through archival materials and conducted oral history interviews to piece together a complex picture revealing the joint maneuverings of government officials in Mexico and the United States and their devastating impact on individuals, families, and communities. By unearthing the struggles and wrenching decisions of Japanese Mexican men and women, she illuminates the politics of gender, race, class, and nationalism in a time of war. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chu.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Matsumoto. I am very, very honored to be here today. I love California. This is one of the places in the world that I would like to live all my life. Actually, I used to live here and was here for decades actually in Los Angeles area. My own history is non-traditional, and that's how we are going to work today, because I'm going to skip, or not just skip, but defer for some minutes my presentation to welcome my dear friend Miguel Juárez, who is going to comment on my work before I enter into the topic that brought me here today. So thank you very much, Miguel, please.
Thank you for attending today's book presentation of Dr. Alejandra Chu's book titled Uprooting Community, Japanese Mexicans, World War II, and the U.S. Mexico Borderlands. Dr. Chu, or Selfa, as she has asked me to refer to, does what many of us who live in the borderlands often think of doing, but maybe some of us have started that process and some of us have not, of delving into our familiar past and uncovering where we come from, who our ancestors were, and what hardships they may have faced tied to the ever-changing legal landscape of Borderlands history, or history in general. Many of us may take our life for granted compared to our antepasados who faced wars, the Great Depression, deportation, and other man-made acts of aggression against them in times of scarcity and xenophobia. I know in my life I am nowhere near piecing my Asian roots the way Selfa has done against the larger setting of Borderlands history. In 1909, I met Selfa in the history department where she graduated from, and I'm a doctoral candidate. And she told me, "Tú eres como nosotros. You are like us." She meant that I had an Asian past as well, although at that point I thought I was just an Asian-looking Chicano and the product of Mexico's mestizaje, which is detailed in her book. Dr. Chu's book examines a relocation program of 1942 as a racial project directed against residents on the periphery, in this case Japanese Mexicans of different nation states, who found themselves without a nation or without nations. She states that her research began as an exploration into the absences of historical memory. It is exactly those absences, or the stories that have not been told, that often elicit the most illuminating histories. Along with the absences, there is also a need to read into the sources and listen to what they tell us. So with that, I will end here and we can hear from Dr. Chu. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. In examining the history of Japanese in the American continent, historian Thomas Calvo argued that they had integrated into New Spain as white persons, and that starts to be a problem in my research. Not only my own investigation, but that of other historians have established the place of Japanese Mexicans in society. Colonial Mexico and contemporary Mexico do consider persons of Asian descent in Mexico as inferior human beings. And that's very painful because I am Chinese Mexican, and it has taken my life to finally come to terms with the racist experiences that I lived as I grew up in Mexico. And that's why I consider California one of my favorite places in the world, because when I moved to California, I found a different environment. I found more persons who looked like me and who understood me and who shared my culture, or at least some aspects of my culture, right? But growing up in Mexico was very difficult for me. I have many experiences to share with you, but I would like to explain to you how I arrived to this research. As my parents migrated to Mexico City, my father from Tamaulipas, from North Mexico, and my mother from Oaxaca, to Mexico City, and they married. They acquired a property in the western zone of Mexico City, and by chance, the Nakamura Ortiz family also bought a property in the same neighborhood. So I grew up with them. Our homes practically did not have limits, no borders. We spent the night in their homes, and they spend their nights also in our family's quarters. However, I never occurred to me that Mr. Rodolfo Nakamura had experienced a level of racism that went beyond what I had experienced, or any of us. I moved to Los Angeles, and then I moved to El Paso, not without, before having passed through Ciudad Juárez. My family moved again from Mexico City to Ciudad Juárez, and once in Juárez I realized that my father had spent his childhood in Ciudad Juárez. I started my doctoral program at the University of Texas El Paso, and was very interested in researching the Chinese community. So I went to the Hemeroteca, right, the newspaper section in the archives in the library, and went through the newspapers, and as I was going through the Second World period, I read a report on a United States platoon having crossed the border to arrest Mexican citizens of Japanese descent in Ciudad Juárez. And I read how the journalist reporting on this incident was very proud of the role of the platoon and the United States consul visiting, if we can call that a visit, several homes, of which I knew the address because I had been living in Ciudad Juárez, and my father also had been there as a resident. So I learned that mainly men, were arrested by the United States Army in Mexico and brought to the United States. It was an amazing report, because I had grown up in a very nationalist family, and my parents considered any type of intervention by the United States as a desecration of Mexico. And they were still experiencing the pain of the secession of the Mexican territory, which became the United States. So thinking about a platoon from the United States crossing the border and violating Mexican sovereignty was a huge issue to me. So I called my father and I asked him, do you know these last names? And I listed the last names that appeared in newspaper, and he said, no, I don't know anything about these persons. And how come? They must have been your neighbors. So something is missing here. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. So ask around. No, nobody knows about them. Okay. So I called my extended family in Mexico, and Georgina Nakamura answered the phone, and I asked her, do you know anything about the United States coming into Mexico and arresting Mexican citizens of Japanese descent? No, I don't know anything, but let me talk to my dad. She went to his bedroom, came back and said, you need to come immediately, but immediately. He says, you have to be here now. So I traveled to Mexico City, and I had one of the most painful days in my whole life. Mr. Rodolfo Nakamura hadn't told his story to anyone in his family. And we cried the whole day. We spent several hours learning about his childhood and how he had been separated from his family when he did not have already a mother because she had recently died, when his father and any other persons of Japanese descent was ordered to leave Palau, Coahuila in a train. And because of their poverty, many of them ended up dead or in farms that were later termed, that were converted into concentration camps. So not only he had grown up without a family due to the relocation program in 1942, but also the trauma was increased by silence. Their own children did not know about the relocation program, and most of the persons who accepted to be interviewed stated that they didn't want their children to grow up with the knowledge that their citizenship was worth nothing because of their ancestry, because they were not persons of indigenous or Spanish descent, and they were going to be considered always the foreign element in Mexican society. So that's how I started my research, and my extended family, the Nakamura family, was generous enough to open the doors of other families so I could learn their story, and also present a narrative that was not official, because the Mexican government, as well as the Japanese government and the United States government, three nation states, obliterated the impact of the relocation program and stated that Japanese Mexicans did not suffer at all, that they were free to leave their homes, and that they were free to live anywhere they wanted to in the interior of Mexico, covering up many years of suffering, many years of unemployment. And so since the official narrative was that they did not suffer, this research is a counter story. It is challenging what the three states have claimed, and how Japanese Mexicans were left without any protection, as you have stated, from any government. Their civil rights, their human rights were taken away, and while in the United States, Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants had one roof over their head. In general, in Mexico, Japanese Mexicans had to try to survive with absolutely no help from any organization. Right? So that's a huge difference. Not only Japanese Mexicans were targeted during the Second Great War. As you know, in Mexico, any person of Asian descent is called a chinito or chinita. You know, this way to infantilize and never accepted that we are complete human beings in so-called terms of endearment. So Korean and Chinese were also attacked during the Second Great War, and some of them were also arrested and interrogated. And actually, Korean immigrants were considered Japanese because of the control that Japan had over Korea. But mainly, of course, after an investigation and research by the Mexican police in all levels, it was mainly Japanese Mexicans who suffered the consequences of the relocation program. So let me start by talking about how, in spite of racism, in spite of anti-Asian sentiments and movements in Mexico, Japanese immigrants were able to form deep relationships with Mexican individuals and families. They established those relationships through marriage, because in different periods and in different regions, Japanese immigrants had the right to marry Mexican women or men, although, as you know, very often we don't even need the permission, right? Even if we are not allowed to marry other persons from other communities, we still do live and marry into other communities, and that was the case of the Japanese immigrants who could certainly bring with them their families or marry Japanese women, but many of them married into Mexican families. The other type of relationship was created through working class consciousness and solidarity. Miners, for example, in Coahuila did fight against oppression within the mines, and most of these struggles were staged against American corporations or British corporations who were already present in Mexico. So the same corporations that exploited Asian immigrants in the United States were exploiting Asian immigrants in Mexico. And the other factor for this class consciousness was created precisely because of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States and how it caused Asian immigrants to come through Mexico and migrate towards the northern area of the country, and that's how we have miners mainly in Coahuila and in Chihuahua taking up the labor struggles that many Mexicans could not take because of their families. They had to take care of their families, and some Japanese felt that they did not have anything to lose actually by organizing the workers in these camps. So that's how we find immigrants, very young immigrants. Some of them having deserted or having avoided being recruited into the military, Japanese military. So we have also different ideologies. We have socialist, anarchist, Catholic, Christians of other denominations. So it is a very heterogeneous community that we can find in Mexico, but many of them trying to reach the United States and passing through the northern states of Mexico. An example of this type of immigration is Mr. Asahiro Tanaka. Asahiro Tanaka was on his way to the United States and working in a ranch in Chihuahua when the Mexican Revolution started. And this is President Francisco I. Madero. He passed through the ranch in which Mr. Asahiro Tanaka was working, and he was a teenager then. And Asahiro Tanaka felt attracted by the revolution movement and promises, and so he joined Mr. Madero. Now, you can think that, well, this is very right. The president had a racial democracy, right, inside and in his program, and that's how Mr. Tanaka became part of his household practically, because since then Mr. Tanaka was very much close to the Madero family. Well, one of the anecdotes that are told about Madero is that he used to eat only after Asahiro Tanaka tried his meals. Right? So that was the value of Mr. Tanaka for Mr. Madero. But beyond Mr. Madero, who was, as we all know, from a bourgeois family, and he did not actually have real democracy in mind, there were other groups within the revolution in which Japanese immigrants participated in a more democratic way. And they were medics, but they were also soldiers and even officers, generals in the Mexican Revolution. Although Pancho Villa is considered a racist person because of his assumed relationships with Asian immigrants, I have found out that that is not completely the case. He had Japanese friends, Japanese cooks, Japanese assistants and generals and officers. So that is also one aspect of the Mexican Revolution from the Japanese diaspora that we need to examine. But that tells us that Japanese immigrants and their families were very important to Mexicans in many ways, and those who were close to them and knew them were able and willing to defend them. And that's a difference between the Mexican relocation program and the United States relocation program. In Mexico, I found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of signatures of Mexican citizens who protested the relocation program and were witness of the value of the Japanese immigrants and their families in each community. And not only the wealthy Japanese, but also the farmers, the fishers, any person of Japanese descent had a place in their community. This is one example of the integration of Japanese immigrants in their Mexican families. This is Mr. Tanaka with his sister-in-law. The children are, of course, Mexican nationals, not citizens, because there is a difference between national and citizen, and that was the rationale for the Mexican government to order the eviction of the children of Japanese immigrants. Even though they were naturalized and the children were born in Mexico, the Mexican government claimed that Japanese Mexican children were only nationals and that they did not have civil rights. So this is before Second Great War. We have one very prosperous family in a very idyllic situation in Guadalajara. This is another example of the type of relationship between that Japanese immigrants developed with Mexicans. This is actually another part of my family, not my extended family in Nakamura, but it's nevertheless part of my heritage and part of my relationship. This is a picture of the wedding of Augusto Fujigaki, who became a minister of health in the 60s in Mexico, and his family, my uncle is there. He is the brother of my mother, so on both sides of my family I do have ties with Japanese immigrants. Another example of this hybridism and how the Japanese Mexican families did integrated different elements of culture, and the persons that I interviewed have always stated that they are Mexicans before anything else, that they love the culture and they also love their ancestry, but they are not only Japanese. And by the way, there was not even one person, one Japanese immigrant or one Japanese Mexican who was tried in court and found guilty of espionage or betraying the nation state. So the rationale of national security did not have actually basis for this displacement. But nevertheless, the refusal to recognize the relocation program as one causing suffering among the Japanese Mexican population can be countered in many ways. One piece of information that I found in the archives of Mexico City stated that in the winter of 1942, a group of men was ordered to relocate to Camargo, Chihuahua, and from them, Tomás Valle, who is a politician of Mexico, he is one of the wealthiest men in Mexico, took this group into his property and made him work for nothing. Every single day they received a cup of food, only one cup for each man, which means their wives and their children did not even receive this ration of food. And that's why one of the women who was present in the camp reported the conditions under which they were living. And so she said that they were almost naked without hope to recover from their losses, since their husbands did not earn a cent for their labor at the camp. The children were not receiving education, and the men did not even have, or the women, did not even have a blanket over their heads. They did not have housing at all. They were living under the trees. And this is winter, and you can imagine northern Mexico at this point is full of snow. If it is in the mountains, probably not there, but still it was very, very cold for the Japanese Mexican families who were living there. Eventually they were moved to the interior of Mexico, but the lie or the myth that they had not suffered any discomfort on their way to Mexico City, it was created not only by the Mexican government but also the United States government and media. In El Paso, it was reported that they were going to earn a living in a prosperous farming community. Now, these are the places that I have located of concentration camps, and although other historians state that they were not concentration camps, that they were farms, I do argue that they were concentration camps because they could not enter the farms without a permission from the government. They could not leave the camp without a permission from the government, and they were highly controlled. If they challenged the orders within the camp, if they refused to work, they were transferred to Perote, which is high security facility in Veracruz, right? So this lack of mobility. Now, not only they needed permissions, but they also needed money, because every single document that they filed had a cost, had a tax that they needed to pay, and they also had to pay translators and writers, because the document had to be written in Spanish, and many of them did not read or write Spanish or even speak Spanish, so they had to pay other persons to do this type of application. So it was almost impossible for the working class Japanese to have the mobility that wealthy Japanese had in Mexico. And that's also one part of my research, that the wealthiest Japanese Mexicans did have mobility and were actually favored by the government, and they were middle persons between the Mexican government and Japan. So this is another heartbreaking case. This is the Takaki family. They lived in Veracruz, a very modest life, but they were happy, as you can see here. And during the Second Great War, when they were relocated, when they were ordered to move to Mexico, the mother, Miss Takaki, was sick already, and she didn't receive proper medical care. She died and left, I believe, 8 children without any type of care. Mr. Takaki did not have any means, and the small business that they had in Veracruz was lost. He was not employable because you can imagine the image of the Japanese during the Second Great War was that of the internal enemy. So Mexican residents of the states in the interior of Mexico who did not know personally any Japanese persons were not willing to employ Japanese immigrants or Japanese Mexicans. So Mr. Takaki was not employable, and it was a very hard decision for him to allow a scientist from Chiapas who was wealthy and had permission to stay in Chiapas to take 3 of his children with him to Chiapas as adopted children. A.T. Matuda, by the way, is a very recognized, prestigious scientist in botanics, and he actually helped Octavio Paz write his haiku poetry because of his knowledge of the plants and flowers in Japanese. So even though the 3 children were living a better life in economic terms, you can see their faces here, right? How when they are with their biological parents, even though they are living a life that is not as comfortable as that lived in Chiapas, their demeanor and their facial expressions changes to reflect that it's still not the ideal situation. Now, in terms of international laws, the United States and Mexico broke every single aspect of the Treaty of Geneva. And that is because Japanese Mexicans did lose all rights, human and civil rights, at once. They were not officially considered enemies. Nevertheless, they were treated as enemies. And the protection that the Convention of Geneva offers to captured enemies was not extended to them. The protection that is extended to, or is supposed to be extended to civilians, was not extended to them either, or refugees. No status was respected in their case. Now, this is not the experience for all Japanese. Not at all. I talked already about the wealthiest Japanese immigrants, but there are also other Japanese Mexicans who were already living in Mexico City. They did not have to renounce to their property. They kept living in their homes, and they still think that the relocation program was not as was not uncomfortable to them, right? But it's a different situation, totally. Nevertheless, the persons that I interviewed in who were in the Misco concentration camp were, and this was a group that occupied the lowest echelons in the concentration camp, including Dr. Hiromoto, who is the youngest child. He was born actually in that concentration camp, and he and his sister reported that there were economic classes within the camp, and that they were starving. They lived a kind of life that was not healthy at all for children, in spite of the education that they received in Japanese and the times in which they were allowed to visit other communities around the Hacienda of Temisco, which is in it's close to Mexico City. Dr. Hiromoto is here too, and this is his father, Dr. Manuel Hiromoto, and he is an immigrant Japanese, and his mother, Rocio Yoshino, was actually born in Mexico. Her mother was Mexican, and they met on the way to the concentration camp in Temisco. In the middle we have Miss Yoshino, who is the sister of Dr. Of the child, then now Dr. Raul Hiramoto. But this story is exceptional in many ways. Dr. Manuel Hiramoto was arrested in Sinaloa before the Second Great War, and he was considered already a rebel. He did not want to, or he was taught as not wanting to present any documentation, but he don't have any with him anyways, and he was accused of being a spy on behalf of the Japanese government. But soon he was traveling with the Mexican army as a doctor, as a medical doctor. He was released, and then I found records of him working as a miner in the mountains of Chihuahua. When the Second Great War broke and he was interned in the Temisco camp, he opposed labor exploitation in the camp. Said, we are working for nothing, just for our food, and that just against any law. And so he organized a group of Japanese men, and he was arrested and taken to Perote. He was relentless in his claims. He wrote numerous letters to different ministers and officers in Mexico. And the legend is, because he's a legend in Temisco and Cuernavaca, and the indigenous communities do revere him very much. He already died, but they think of him as the magical doctor, and they state that he used to escape the Temisco camp to heal the indigenous families. And also, he was very proud of being the godfather of more than 500 indigenous children. Which also takes me to another topic, which is the doctors who came from Japan, and most of them renounced to a life of wealth and devoted themselves to be healers in indigenous communities or rural communities, and worked side by side with farmers. So that's how they also earned the respect and the love of the persons who fought the relocation program in Mexico. So I have many stories to share with you, but I think that I will leave my talk here so you become interested and buy my book. Or recommend it for your classes, friends, and family. Makes a very good Christmas gift too. And birthday present. But I think these are some of the contributions that I make to the field. This is the first monography exclusively analyzing the Japanese-Mexican experience during the Second Great War. It covers these fields: the Second Great War, the Asian diaspora, borderlands, Latin American and Mexican history. It does challenge official histories, and it addresses solidarity too, right? The solidarity expressed by the Mexicans in defense of the Japanese immigrants and their children, and also integrates first-person narratives through oral histories. I have many more contributions to the field, but I'm going to stop here. And if you have any question, I will be more than happy to talk about this topic that is very close to my heart. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Oh, okay, sorry.
Were there any instances where Japanese Mexicans during World War II volunteered to join either the Mexican or U.S. military, as we saw in the United States?
Not that I know. Some Japanese Mexicans were interned in Crystal City in Lordsburg here, right? They were actually Japanese Mexican families along with the Latin American Japanese families. But the cases that I know of, no, they did not join the army as Japanese Americans did.
I think this is really part of the American policy that extended out into South America. You know, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, and I think these countries are also pressured by the American government during World War II to comply with their policies, and these are really extensions of the American policy during World War II, and which goes back to really the beginning of the 1900s. And I think each country had to comply within their means, you know. And I don't think because I was in a concentration camp here too, and I served. We lived 3 years in the camp, so I know all about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you go back and look at the American policies and how these things were created, and these are really the pressures went down to Mexico and Peru, and each country did it a little differently. The Peruvians were sent to Crystal City, and Mexico did whatever they were able to do. I don't think they were completely in favor, but I don't think they were willing to fight with the United States over these issues. So they did whatever means that they had to do, comply in some way, because some Mexican Japanese have done well, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because I have friends in Mexico.
That's right. The conditions that worked in favor of the relocation program were very complex, but one element that determined the eviction of Japanese Mexicans from the borderlands was that Manuel Ávila Camacho, the then president of Mexico, had been elected through fraudulent elections, right? So there was a concern by the United States government and the Mexican government about the how they were going to control the Mexican population that was that was not in agreement with the terms in which Ávila Camacho was president of Mexico, or became president of Mexico. So this was an excellent opportunity and justification for Miguel Ávila Camacho to accept the army's training of the Mexican army, the weapons that they received, and the money that they received in order to actually subdue the guerrilleros, the guerrillas, and any attempt by any citizen in Mexico to overthrow his government. So he was very happy to receive this money if that if it meant to displace Japanese Mexicans. Well, be it. No. Yes.
Do you find that I guess so the basis for relocating peoples was based on like their immigration status, correct? And like if they had just immigrated, or do you find that there were people who maybe spoke Spanish like a little better, or were Mexican passing, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
that had different experiences than Japanese or Japanese Mexican people who perhaps spoke with an accent or were not as Mexican passing, as maybe the term could be admitted?
This was a racial program,
Yes.
period. Racial program, and I found a document that stated that even though the officers who were trying to discern who was to leave the Temisco camp in 1945, they were worried about the one-drop policy that was applied by the United States. So they were accepting that it was the United States orders first of all, and second, that the one-drop rule was applying to Japanese because of the orders that the United States government gave to Mexican officers. So in my case, I grew up in Mexico, and some Mexicans asked me, where did you learn how to speak Spanish? And I said, it's my first language. Oh, you speak very well. You can even say it's your first language. No, it's my only language. Where did you learn it? Come on, see. So they see me as a foreign in Mexico. And I had to always show my passport ever since I was a kid, and when I was with my father, who spoke also perfect Spanish, even more. So it's racial, it's not an immigration status, it's totally racial. You know, so many of the persons who were in the concentration camps were actually citizens of Mexico, not only by naturalization, but also by birth. Yes. Yes.
Again, I'd like to commend you for this groundbreaking book and study, and point out one potential contribution and one area for further research. The first contribution is you bring out that in Mexican society, there is diversity within Mexican culture, not just Japanese, but Africans and Koreans and Chinese, and today Central Americans. So that's a first, bringing out that Mexico is a heterogeneous population, and of course indigenous folks. The second contribution and potential further research is to bring out the contradictions, even the hypocrisy in Mexican foreign policy, which will criticize the United States, but yet Mexico has had at least equal levels of nativism, racism, classism, but refuses to address it. And this is really more to encourage Mexican foreign policy, internal policy, to recognize this diversity, and to also recognize it too must address many of its own issues in terms of immigrants, just as we have to as well, and perhaps a more equal footing between Mexico and the U.S. in addressing their own issues.
That's right. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you. Yes, I think that well, that is gonna be also part of my lines of research. Whiteness in Mexico, white privilege in Mexico, but in relationship to the Asian immigration, I think it is very, very important because the Mexican government has also instilled a sense of difference among Asian immigrants, and think about Chinese immigrants as inferior to Japanese immigrants at some points, right? And then Japanese immigrants inferior to Korean and so on. So playing each other against the rest of the members of the Asian diaspora, and then also Japanese against German and Italian and other immigrant groups. So yes, it is very, very interesting to see how the Mexican population is very heterogeneous, and at the same time is racist in many regards, and always claiming that Mexico is a racial democracy, which is not. Right, thank you very much. Yes. Any other question? Complaint? Yes.
I really this is an amazing book, and it's a wonderful contribution. I was just curious because I was so fascinated by the oral histories that you did, and the way those voices begin to come forth. I mean, you cover a lot, so there's just a little. But I was wondering if this research has come out in any formats that were accessible to the people you interviewed or their families, and if so, what their response has been, or what responses you've received.
Definitely. One of the deepest ways in which this research has transformed me is recognizing role of the persons I am in contact with and who are members of the community affected in my research and the feedback that I must receive from them. When I interviewed Mr. Nakamura, I realized he was dying. And then when I interviewed Dr. Hiromoto, I also learned that he was very, very sick. So I knew that my research was going to take many years and that the publication other years, and that it was going to be written in an academic language for academicians. And so I decided to write a novel with the oral histories. And so I wrote this novel in 3 days. I had to because they were dying. And I did not have time to do it in any other period of my life. So I wrote it and then I sent it to them before publication and asked them if they wanted me to modify any aspect of it. Now I would actually write it in different terms because I think that there are some problems with it and Orientalism, for example, in some points I perceive myself as endorsing Orientalism. But at the time, it was a work that was urgent, and so the defects that it has, I forgive myself. And mainly the women who read my work were very enthusiastic, and they also asked me to publish it immediately. So that's how I published that novel, and it is actually a hybrid. It has short stories, poetry, my own poetry and the poetry of some Japanese immigrants. So that's how I try to make up for my publishing it in English and in academia. This is in Spanish. There is a translation to English, but originally was published in Spanish and with that very subjective view.
And what is the title?
The title is Mudas las Garzas, which is silent herons. Silent herons, because to me, as I said, silence and the absence, right? The absence of recognition, of absence of populations is very important in telling of the power of the state on our lives. Well, I really thank you with all my heart for your presence today. And thank you to Rebecca especially and Chayan for receiving me today. Thank you.